Okay. Yeah, it should just be like YouTube / College Muscogee.
So I'll put it up for student out, so if they don't see it from there.
Okay, so we've got our audio.
I'm just excited to have you back on campus.
I'm excited to be here. I really like working with you guys.
Switch right here.
Okay.
And
Okay, do I need to press anything to turn it on?
If you have to,
That's
use the
on?
restroom or something, yeah, you're on now.
Okay.
Yeah, so if you have to just turn it off and it should be Okay, so that's good to go. And it is live right now.
Do you guys want to do a sound check?
I think we're good for sound.
Okay.
Yeah. And
It's
like I said, we're live, but it was unannounced, so there's probably nobody on the stream.
Okay.
I'll go check, but we're getting this off whenever we
Okay.
do, so. We want to wait, we can wait for someone to get show up.
Yeah, I'll probably give them another 5 minutes or so before.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah, well, you're live, so if you wanted to turn your mic on and tell anybody out there or whatever. I don't know, or are we gonna take the little machine out of here, or is it just gonna sit over behind the chair? I'm gonna go tell
we need
everybody.
to
we're
sign
live.
in?
No, that's just for some students.
Okay.
You're in one of my classes. Did you get your email today?
Here.
Conference. That's all if you want a homework test.
Where
If
is
you
it?
can't see it, we can take it out.
You can go live.
So which one?
We only have 1 or 2. No. The main display is, you just can't bring any compartments at all time. And you find them. Yes. Okay. Graceful cultural archives. It's small, but.
This is like, I think I'm a little over halfway. So the only other event in Oklahoma is Oklahoma City. And then, well, I'm way more than halfway. Because then there's one more virtual event. For Chicago. And then I do Albuquerque and Seattle and Texas. So I'm like, I think it was like 15 total, so I'm like 2/3 of the way through it. So, but it's actually pretty spread out. So Oklahoma City out like next week, and then Seattle and Texas will actually be in November.
Everybody has to know it's there, right?
Yeah, it's not too bad. So the last couple weeks have felt really full, but middle Sunday, which is good. I'm kind of sick of traveling. Not this isn't bad, driving down here for the day isn't bad, but airports
The bigger that we get, the more I'd say it's common.
Yeah.
We travel quite a bit, and it gets tiring for sure. Depending on what you're doing. Because I was telling the guy from here that I trained to. I'm glad.
Yeah. Well, this building is so cool.
Yeah. This is
Just one part of the whole thing, right?
yeah, when we started off, I told them we're gonna have some good parts. It's been
Oh, cool. What was the movie? Oh, wow.
That's just for students.
Okay, yes.
Yeah,
If you guys don't mind.
But yeah, he grew up.
Audio filtering and stuff. Exactly how it's going out on last street.
It's historic. He said you can actually pull up.
Yeah.
He said they just go around the.
Oh, yeah, when you get that done, when do you have a date you have to spend and all that? Oh, wow. Oh, wow. Testing 1, 2, 3.
Okay, good. I had to mute them ceiling. All right, SJ, everybody. Welcome to the college. We have Rebecca Nagle here, author of By the Fire We Carry. She's going to be here to read a portion of her book and answer some questions. So get ready to ask some questions if you have them. We're just glad to have her here on campus. She's been here a couple times, and we always have a good experience with her here. So I hope you guys enjoy, and I'm going to hand it over to Rebecca.
What do? Can you guys hear me? Cool. I'm so excited to be here. I always have a great time whenever I'm able to make it to campus. So Thank you to Colton and thank you to the College of Muscogee Nation for having me. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for masking. I had a really rough time the last time I got COVID, so I'm trying to not repeat that. So I appreciate you guys doing that. My book, By the Fire We Carry, talks about the McGirt Supreme Court decision that resulted in the largest restoration of tribal land in U.S. history. The Supreme Court affirmed the reservation of Muscogee Nation, and then based on that decision, lower courts here in Oklahoma affirmed actually 8 other reservations here in eastern Oklahoma. And the book follows the story of the case that actually started as a murder in 1999 near the community of Vernon. And a Muscogee citizen murdered another Muscogee citizen. And in the early 2000s, his federal public defenders came up with this argument of, wait a minute, we don't think Oklahoma has jurisdiction to execute our client because the crime actually happened on a reservation. And that question of whether or not the Muscogee Reservation went all the way to the Supreme Court. And so I'm going to read a little bit of 2 chapters, the chapter where the case goes to the Supreme Court and then the chapter when the decision comes out. There are a couple people who are in the book that you guys might know. Rosemary McCombs Maxey, who teaches here at the college and the language program, is in the book, and then former Principal Chief James Floyd also talked to me about his experiences following the case. So with that, we'll get started with the reading, and then at the end of the reading, we'll have time for questions. Okay. When the doors to the Supreme Court finally opened on November 27, 2018, Rosemary McCombs Maxey was guided in. She sat in silence as a trickle of light snuck through big, flowing red drapes. Tall, white pillars symmetrically encircled the chairs where she sat, 4 on each side. Before seeing it in person, Rosemary imagined the courtroom was large and spacious. She was surprised by how small it was. From behind towering crimson velvet curtains, the justices of the Supreme Court emerged. Rosemary was seated towards the front, unbelievably close to the justices, so close she could barely see their faces over the raised bench. Clarence Thomas, you could only see his forehead, she said, and then Ginsburg, you could just see an inch of her. In an antiquated ceremony harking back to the town criers of medieval England, the Marshal of the U.S. Supreme Court interrupted the silence. Oyez, oyez, oyez. All persons having business before the Honorable, the Supreme Court of the United States are admonished to draw near and give their attention, for the court is now sitting, they shouted. God save the United States and this honorable court. Into his microphone, Chief Justice Roberts announced, we'll hear arguments next in case 17-1107, Carpenter versus Murphy. Miss Blatt, he said, and invited Oklahoma's lawyer to the podium. Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court, Oklahoma's lawyer began. Eastern Oklahoma is not an Indian reservation. Lisa Blatt's neatly trimmed bob bounced as she spoke. Her straight hair matched her long face, punctuated by thinly framed glasses. Congress stripped the former Indian territory of reservation status by terminating all tribal sovereignty over the area to create Oklahoma, Blatt continued in her opening remarks. Disestablishment occurred, but then she was quickly interrupted. Exactly when did it do this? Justice Sonia Sotomayor wanted to know. What's the exact date? I mean, Blatt began, our position is that it was done by statehood. Our position is more fundamentally that we don't have to, but Sotomayor wanted an exact date. If Congress did disestablish the reservation, surely Oklahoma could say when. We don't have to give you a date, Blatt curtly replied. Rome did not fall in a day. The birth of Oklahoma, the state claimed, was a legislative campaign to dissolve the 5 tribes' communal territories. From 1893 to 1907, Congress passed a raft of legislation that divided up communally held tribal lands and diminished the power and self-governance of Muscogee Nation. Both sides agreed Congress took a lot of things away from the tribe during this time. They disagreed, however, on whether or not that included the reservation. During oral arguments, Blatt harped on everything taken during allotment to argue the reservation was gone too. All tribal courts are abolished, all tribal taxes are abolished, tribal law was unenforceable, she listed off.
Even tribal property was seized. Every piece of paper, record, book, dollar, bill, or coin or property, their buildings, their furniture, their desks, everything was taken from the tribes. According to the brief submitted by Oklahoma and the United States, the Muscogee Reservation was destroyed, dissolved, eliminated, abolished, liquidated, eviscerated, extinguished, divested, overthrown, and disintegrated until it was nothing but a historical artifact. In short, what Congress took away from Muscogee Nation during allotment was everything. It was a superficial argument based on circumstantial evidence, but if you don't know the detailed history of allotment, it sounded probable. After all, why would Congress take the buildings, furniture, and even paper away from a tribe, but leave their reservation? Sitting near the front, Chief Floyd tried not to show what he was thinking on his face. During his administration, the tribe regained ownership of their historic council house in downtown Okmulgee, one of the buildings, as Blatt pointed out, that was seized during allotment. Floyd remembers local white residents bringing back the desks and chairs their grandparents had looted. It was an awful history to use against them. You can't unhear what they're saying, he told me. To Rosemary, Lisa Blatt's version of history felt familiar. As a Native child in Oklahoma schools, she had been taught that once Oklahoma became a state, the treaty rights of her tribe were destroyed. Her school even had the kids acted out. Every November, on the anniversary of statehood, the school put on a play where the Native children and the white children acted out a mock wedding. It symbolized how the state of Oklahoma was created through the marriage of her tribe's treaty territory and the white settlers. At the conclusion of the play, the Native students sang a traditional Muscogee hymn, and then the entire auditorium sang the musical anthem, Oklahoma. By the time Chief Floyd found himself back on the front steps of the court, the crowd had thinned out. Looking out at the clear blue sky hovering over the meticulously manicured Capitol lawn, Floyd felt hopeful. My instinct was telling me we've won this case, he remembers. In the back of Floyd's mind was, of course, the possibility that Muscogee Nation could lose. It was hard to think about. The tribe had already lost their homeland once. After the devastation of removal, they rebuilt, reestablished their fires, their tribal towns, their government, and their way of life on land that was promised to them for forever. And now that second home was at stake. With the stroke of a pen, the Supreme Court could take it away. Okay, then we're gonna skip forward to the chapter about the McGirt decision. July 9th, 2020 was the last day for the Supreme Court to issue its decisions for the term. There were 3 cases left, 2 that would determine whether or not Donald Trump had to reveal his taxes, and McGirt. Rosemary McCombs Maxey was at her home near Dustin, Oklahoma, in the southern corner of the Muscogee Reservation. From the large windows in her family room, she could see the pasture lightly dusted from the dirt road. She had been told by one of her language students, Sarah Deere, that they were expecting the decision any day. When her phone rang and the caller ID came up with Sarah's name, she knew what it was about. Former Principal Chief James Floyd was 6 months out of office and following the news from home. Like many people that day, he was hitting refresh on the popular SCOTUS blog. As the editor-in-chief of Muscogee Media, Angel Ellis knew that July 9th, 2020 was going to be a busy day. She tried to go to bed early. To her surprise, she fell right asleep. But then at 4 a.m., she woke up. She got up and made coffee. She went and got donuts. In the dark, she watered her tomato plants. Finally, she just went to work. The newsroom at Muscogee Media was packed with staff waiting for the Supreme Court's announcements. On decision days, SCOTUS blog is almost like Twitter, filled with a river of constant posts, only a few of which actually announced the day's decision. More than once, Angel saw the flash of a new post, thought that was it, but then it wasn't. I would just catch my breath, she remembers. When I sat down at the desk in my office, the pit of my stomach churned. I was a mess. I watched the time on my phone as the minutes marched forward from 8:55 to 8:58 until finally it struck 9 a.m. Central Time. Like everyone else that morning, I feverishly started hitting refresh. So many people were now on the site, it wouldn't load. I sat through agonizing minutes until I saw 2 simple leaks to the opinions in Murphy and McGirt. I clicked on McGirt. The first thing I wanted to know was who wrote the opinion. In my mind, just the name would indicate if we had won or lost and by how much. I scrolled past the syllabus to the bottom of the 4th page. In small, capital letters, the PDF read, Gorsuch. I started screaming, and then I wept. On the far end of the Trail of Tears was a promise, the opinion began. Forced to leave their ancestral lands in Georgia and Alabama, the Creek Nation was given assurances that their new lands in the West would be theirs forever. Today, we are asked whether the land these treaties promise remain an American Indian reservation for the purposes of federal criminal law. Because Congress has not said otherwise, we hold the government to its word. That first month of summer in Oklahoma had been hot and dry. For weeks, rain was nowhere in sight. The lush weeds, wildflowers, and grass turned brown and crisp at their edges. Even the trees looked tired. That morning, the sky cracked open and it poured. A hard, pelting rain that pooled in the dirt. It was as if the earth knew. You can deny a people what is rightfully theirs for only so long. Eventually, something must give. That day, across eastern Oklahoma, tribal citizens celebrated the victory with joy and abundance. But it was joy that also cut hard and deep. Our blood and our bones knew how much had been lost to reach this one act of justice. When Angel Ella saw the sky playing with the idea of rain that morning, she thought maybe it was a bad sign. The clouds felt ominous. But then, timed almost to the second she realized her tribe had won, the sky erupted. And then the rain felt good. It felt like her ancestors were crying with her. It's been a century of loss, she told me. For Indigenous people, it's been stomped, trod, moved over, and just railroading. And finally, some people with power are like, we're gonna make the bleeding stop. That never happens. Rosemary McCombs Maxey is a woman of faith. All along, she believed her tribe would win. But on the phone that morning, she was in shock. I can't really believe it, she said into the receiver. Before James Floyd could read the decision, his phone was ringing. People called from everywhere. Some were ecstatic, others were sobbing, most were simply overwhelmed. Chief Justice Roberts, who authored the dissent in the case, thought it was improbable that unbeknownst to anyone for the past century, a huge swath of Oklahoma is actually a Creek Indian reservation. But for Cheyenne and Muscogee advocate, writer, and elder Suzanne Harjo, in that century lies a lesson. Tribes have to keep asserting their sovereignty. There has to be Native people who keep saying, this is who we are, this is what we do, this is what we have responsibility for, these are rights that we have, she told me, no matter what kind of trickery there's been to try and convince us otherwise. For Harjo, the McGirt decision is why Native people must never give up, and not to be deterred by the losses we face, even when it's a century of loss. We're just not on the same timelines that other people are on this country. Indigenous people are on a longer timeline. We are in a much longer one, backwards and forwards. And a lot of things are going to get straightened out along the way because they are too blatant to stand. The history of tribal land in the United States has moved, for the most part, unforgivingly in one direction. Prior to July 9th, 2020, American Indian reservations comprised only 2% of all land in the United States, or about 56 million acres. For perspective, nearly 200 million acres is reserved for national forests. In the expansion of this great nation, our government set aside more land for trees than for indigenous people. The McGirt decision resulted in the largest restoration of tribal land in U.S. history. Taken together, the 5 tribes' reservations cover 19 million acres, about half the land in Oklahoma and most of the city of Tulsa. It's an area larger than West Virginia and 9 other U.S. states. There is an easy mistake to make in telling the story of this case, which is to say that the reservation was given back to the tribe. This would be incorrect. Despite Oklahoma's position in this case, despite everything that has been taken away from our tribes, our reservations were never abolished. And you can't give back what already belongs to someone. In one of the darkest chapters of American history, this land was promised to us for as long as the grass grows or water runs. In eastern Oklahoma, the grass is still growing, the water is still running, our fires still burn, and we are still here. And despite the grave injustice of history, our legal right to our land never ended. Thank you. Cool. So we have some time for any questions that people might have. Oh, yeah, is that a hand? Oh, nope. Well, if anybody has any questions about the court case or the aftermath or the book or the process of writing the book, don't be shy. Oh, yep. Yeah, so I found out about the case in 2017, actually through a Facebook post from Sarah Deer, who's a Muscogee legal scholar. And I started following it then and wrote about it for some news articles and for a podcast called This Land. So I was familiar with it, but when I started the book, I wanted to do a lot more research, and so I kind of started from scratch. So one of the first things I did was just collect all the documents that kind of had anything to do with the case. And since the original murder happened in 1999 and Patrick Murphy's case had gone on for 20 years, there was a lot of paperwork. So I got the original trial transcripts, and then I got kind of basically every piece of paper that had been filed from his first appeals all the way up to the Supreme Court. And then I went out and did a lot of interviews. So folks who were connected to the case, so people like James Floyd and also the lawyers who worked on the case. But then I also went and talked to people who were involved in it back when it was just a death penalty appeal. So I interviewed the federal public defenders who worked on the case back in the early 2000s. I interviewed Patrick Murphy and some folks from Vernon and from the community there. The police officer who found the murder weapon, sort of just kind of anybody that would honestly talk to me. And so, and one of the reasons that I did so much research is I think that this case obviously made history, especially here in Oklahoma. But I think because, it was the Murphy case and then it became McGirt, that I just hadn't seen anywhere where the whole story of the case had been documented. And I really felt like we needed that, It's, this case came out of a very specific set of unique circumstances. And there were a lot of forks in the road where it could have not happened. And there were also a lot of people who felt kind of like unsung heroes who had helped move it along in its 20-year history that I wanted a place where those names were captured and those people were known. So, but thank you for your question. So that was kind of how I went about it. Got sort of my hands on all the pieces of paper that I could find and then reached out and talked to a bunch of people. Pretty much anyone who talked to me. Cool. Any other questions? Yeah, right there. That was a good question. And I'm just going to restate it in case anybody can't hear. But the question was, what was the biggest challenge in writing the book? I think the hardest part to report on were the history sections. So the book kind of goes back and forth from following the story of the case to going back in time. And the parts that it goes back in time for are the removal of our tribes from the Southeast and then also allotment. And reading those, and so I went back to a lot of primary source documents. So whether it was like congressional records or newspaper articles or court records, and reading a lot of those primary sources was really difficult. One, I think especially with removal, but also with allotment, is that the sources are describing pretty horrific violence and pretty traumatic violence. And then the thing that was hard on top of that was that often they're written by the people who are actually carrying that violence out. So they're written by like the soldiers or, you know, like a lot of the documents about actual removals, like correspondence within the Army. So it's like somebody who's like leading a detachment, like reporting back to their supervisors about what's happening. And a lot of so it's this horrific trauma that's happening, and then the people who are writing about it are often writing about it in ways that are really racist, and that was really hard. I'll never forget, I read a document that was it was with a detachment, one of the first detachments that left from Seminole Nation, a very small faction of the tribe that agreed to move. And the person who was leading the detachment was trying to get them to like walk further and further every day, and was kind of complaining almost about how they were lazy, and then in the same breath was documenting how many people were dying. And so those types of documents were really hard to read. Yeah. Thank you for that question. Any other questions? Yeah. Oh yeah, that's a good question. I think connecting with folks like Rosemary, so, and just meeting people. So, like I interviewed a former police officer with Muscogee Nation he was actually the guy who found the murder weapon, and we like met in the parking lot of the Henrietta Walmart. I like interviewed him in my car. Or, you know, I would drive out to Vernon and kind of just like knock on doors. And by doing that, I met like a pastor of a church, and his son was actually the person who found George Jacobs and called 911. And so meeting people. And Rosemary, in addition to teaching here, she runs a language school out of her house in the summertime for a week in the summer. And so I wanted to include that in the book because for me, that's kind of why the land and the reservation rights matter. It's not just so that we have jurisdiction over like this many acres, but because those things like culture and language and land and sovereignty, I feel like you can't pull them apart, right? You know, it's like that's all connected. And so I got to go to Rosemary's house and watch her language school and get to know her. So I think that was my favorite part, was just getting to know people. You know, even the lawyers that worked on the original appeal, hearing their perspective and hearing why they spent decades of their life fighting the death penalty, which is a perspective I didn't really understand until I talked to them. You know, you'd think, how could you defend somebody who had done something so horrible? But hearing from them about just the types of relationships that they had with their clients was really interesting. So I think connecting to people for me was my favorite part of reporting the book. Great question. Cool, yeah, up front.
So regarding the aftermath, how in depth with like the legal details, I'm just curious about what anecdotes or information.
Yeah, so about the after the case. Yeah, so actually I go into that in the book. So chapter 14 and 15 are kind of about the aftermath, but 15, the last chapter of the book, like goes into it in really big details. So So, you know, the Supreme Court decision in July of 2020 was just about the McGirt Reservation, and then the reservations of my tribe, Cherokee Nation, and then also the Chickasaw, Choctaws, and Seminoles were affirmed about like 9 months later in like the spring of 2021. And the most immediate impact of the reservations being affirmed is who prosecutes what crimes. And so the state of Oklahoma lost jurisdiction on those lands at first. This changes, but if the victim or if the perpetrator was native. But since we're not the majority population on our reservations, it wasn't a crazy amount of cases. And so Oklahoma did a lot of exaggerating the impacts. And so just like one example, so since jurisdictions shifted, they kept saying, well, all these old convictions are going to get thrown out. And basically like the jailhouse doors are going to open up and all these people are going to go free. And so the governor was saying that 76,000 past convictions would be overturned. And at the time he was saying that that was 3 times the total prison population in the state. And it was also over 60 times the number of Native people incarcerated from like the areas of the reservations. And then what it ended up being is that it was about 200 cases, a little over 200 cases that actually got overturned because of McGirt. And of those 200 people, most people were either retried in the tribal or the federal system, and it was 68 people who were actually released from prison. And that's not nothing for those families. You know, that's still a trauma, especially for some of the more violent crimes, and even the crimes where people were retried in federal court, for those victims to have to go through a second trial. The impact is not nothing, but it's not what Oklahoma claimed it would be. And unfortunately, I think we're still kind of in it. There's been a really big backlash from the state to try and fight the actual decision and what it means. And so Governor Stitt and his attorney general actually asked the Supreme Court to reverse its decision over 50 times. They went back to the court 50 times, 50 separate times, asking the court to change its opinion. The court didn't do that, but it did take a case called Castro Huerta, where the court gave back Oklahoma a little bit of the power it lost on reservations. So now, and not just Oklahoma, but all states can prosecute crimes if the perpetrator is non-native, but the victim is native. And before that, those crimes would go to the federal government or to the tribe. And so, and I would argue that we're sort of still in that backlash, whether it's, you know, traffic tickets or taxes, or, you know, all the different kinds of ways that the case might have implications. Oklahoma's being really stubborn. You know, I talked to tribal leaders who would just want to have a contract with the state to say, you know, if we're going to have people that we need to put in, you know, a mental health institution instead of prison, can we like contract with you for beds? And Oklahoma would just say no. And so there were a lot of blockades put up. But I think the other part of that story, which I get into a little bit, is how much the tribes stepped up. You know, tribes hired new police, hired new prosecutors. Some tribes even built new courthouses, revamped their criminal codes, doubled, quadrupled. I don't know how to say one bigger than that, but whatever 5 times is, you know, but like hugely expanded their prosecutorial and police capacity. So one of the reporting trips I did, I got to do a ride-along in Choctaw Nation with one of their police officers, and see kind of also a day in Choctaw Nation's courts. And so I don't think that the transition was perfect, and I think that there are still things that are getting worked out, but I think that we do have to give our tribes a lot of credit for all that they did do. Thank you for that question. Let's see what time it is. Cool. Any other questions? Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. I filed some. Oh, yeah, sorry. Thank you for reminding me. The question was, were there any interviews or sources that I was denied while I was reporting on the case? So I filed a couple of open records. I filed a few different open records requests, which are like for like governments to like share documents with you. Usually it's just a bunch of emails. And so I filed them with My Tribe Cherokee Nation, in collaboration with the Citizen of Muscogee Nation. We filed one with this tribe. And then I filed one against the Attorney General of Oklahoma and the governor. I had to sue the Attorney General and the Governor of Oklahoma to get those records. And what I wanted was, I don't know if you guys remember the agreement in principle. It sort of flamed out very quickly, but there was an agreement that lasted for basically like 48 hours between the state of Oklahoma and the tribes about possible congressional legislation in response to the decision. And I wanted to see what the correspondence had been between tribal leaders and the Attorney General's office, because there was a lot of different stories that were told afterwards, and I just wanted to see the emails. And then the other thing I wanted to see, so that was kind of the request to the Attorney General's office, and then the other thing that I wanted to see was Governor Stitt's correspondence with oil and gas leaders leading up to the decision and then after the decision. So I did eventually get those records back from the state, but I had to sue to get them. And then what I got was redacted. So I didn't get to see everything, but I did get a lot of information that I wanted. Thanks. Cool. Any other questions? Yeah, right here.
What advice would you give to students that are maybe interested in writing?
Yeah, my biggest piece of advice would be just to write, and to develop a practice of writing, and also to try and find a place for your writing to live. And so if that's a local newspaper, if that's a school newspaper, if it's a blog, I wrote for a lot of different blogs, like back in the 2010s when blogging was a thing. I feel like it's like less of a thing now, but I used to write for like Huffington Post used to have a really big blog where they would like give you a blog account and then you could kind of just like post whatever you wanted to on there. And so I used to do that. I used to write for websites that aren't around anymore, like Everyday Feminism. And that was where I got a lot of my like early work. And I would write for like Indian Country Today. And so it was a lot of places like that. And then I sort of was able to build up both like my skills as a writer and my resume to then try and like pitch to larger outlets. The other piece of advice I would give is to find peers and to develop relationships. And so there's actually, if you're interested, there's a lot of different kinds of writing, but if you're specifically interested in journalism, I would really recommend getting involved in the Indigenous Journalists Association. And they actually have a lot of programs for college students and for young journalists. So they have like fellowships, they have, I know that they do stuff where they help students afford to be able to go to the conference, but other Indigenous journalists, like when have helped me out in so many ways, whether it's like, oh, you want to pitch to the Washington Post, here's an email address of an editor that I worked with there that is good, or even just like being able to like call somebody up and complain or work through problems. And people gave me a lot of suggestions when I was starting out and a lot of advice. And so those were the two things that helped my career when I was like, I want to be a writer, but I don't know how, was calling and talking to people that were and developing those relationships and those friendships. And then just pitching and trying to like find places for my writing to live when I was just starting out. And so think about places where your writing could live. And if you're into poetry, like finding places to maybe send your poems or fiction. And like I said, if you're interested in journalism, I would really check out the Indigenous Journalism Association, because they have a lot of really great resources. They even do they have partnerships with some journalism schools where they'll, like a Native student every year gets a full ride. So there's things to apply for them that's both the support of networking and then also material support. They have, I think it's called Reporting for America. I can't remember the name of it, but they also have a fellowship where it places emerging journalists at a news outlet for a year. So there's a lot of really good opportunities through them. And Becca Lansbury, who's Muscogee and who used to be the executive editor of Muscogee Media, is the director of the Indigenous Journalists Association. So if anybody here knows Becca, she's really, really cool. Cool. Any other questions? Yeah. Like a follow-up to the book? Oh, what's still going on with the case? Oh, that's a good question. Honestly, the thing that I wanted to report on more after writing the book is actually allotment. So I dug into a couple families' stories while reporting the book. One story that actually is in the book but isn't featured, and then a story that I go into more in depth of a woman named Millie Naharkey. So she was a Muscogee woman who was she got a child's allotment. She was a baby when allotment happened, but she got valuable oil land. And then right before her 18th birthday, she was actually kidnapped and kind of held, her family was supposed to go on a road trip, but really it was some oil prospectors trying to trick her into signing away her land. And just everything that you can imagine happened to this woman. She was kidnapped, she was assaulted, she was assigned a guardian. And I think that what the little bit of digging into allotment that I did for this book, there's 3 chapters on allotment, made me really think that I think we haven't had a full reckoning about what happened to citizens of the 5 tribes during allotment. I think we're starting to talk about the Osage murders more, and even the Tulsa race massacre more in the past 10 years. But I think there's this extreme level of violence and criminality of what happened to allottees of the 5 tribes, right there in the early 1900s, as in 1900, that I feel like it hasn't been documented. I think in Still the Waters Run does a really good job of documenting the government corruption and how bad the federal policies were. But I feel like on top of the failure of government, there was a level of just criminality and theft and violence that I don't think we've really fully unpacked and uncovered. So that's kind of the next thing I want to work on, is digging into that and writing about that more. So thank you for that question. Cool. Yeah?
Are there any works that were inspirational or that you enjoy or in a similar area
Oh yeah, that's a great question. A couple books I thought about a lot that aren't on the same topic at all, but I thought about a lot in terms of how they were written, if that makes any sense. There's a book by Isabel Wilkerson called The Warmth of Other Suns, and it's about the Great Migration of Black people from the South to northern and western cities trying to escape the violence and terror of the Jim Crow South. And the book is just really beautiful, and to me it was a really good example of, because I wanted to talk about history in the book, but I wanted to tell it in a way that wasn't a list of facts, that was kind of a story and was personal, if that makes sense. And I think The Warmth of Other Suns does that really, really well. She gives you a lot of information about the Great Migration, but she tells the story of it through 3 families that you kind of follow throughout the book. And I also, because the book kind of has this double weave, and you follow 3 stories that are kind of braided together. So I thought about that a lot. And then the other book I thought about a lot was Plague of Doves by Louise Erdrich, which is fiction. But if you guys have ever read a Louise Erdrich novel, a lot of times it has like a few different threads, and she'll sort of jump around in the story. And since my book had different threads, I kind of knew I needed to do that and keep readers engaged. So the thing I love about Erdrich's books is like she'll jump from one thing to the other, but then you're like still completely in it because her writing is so good. So I was like, how do I do that? When I was reading that book in particular. And then some books I read in terms of research. And I read And Still the Waters Run by Angie DeBow. And also really looked at that to see like what documents she was looking at and where she did her research. I read The Politics of Indian Removal by Michael Green, Rivers of Sand by, I forget his name, I think his last name is Havman. And then Cherokee Tragedy. I also would really recommend Ties That Bind by Taya Miles. And then I've Been Here All the While by Elena Roberts. So those were some books that I read really carefully to help me with the research that I did. Cool. Let me see what time it is. Cool. I think we have time for like maybe like a couple more questions. Does anybody else have a question? Or we can, oh yeah, Galen. Yeah, so the question was, is if this discussion is going to be on the podcast. So probably not, to be honest. Well, so the first season of the podcast covered the Murphy and the McGurk case. And so that's probably, that part is wrapped. But I'm talking with some other Native writers about working on a possible collaboration that might take shape as a podcast in the next couple years. So it's still really early, but we're talking about like a writing collaboration project to talk about kind of how, even though it's been erased, both the history of colonization, but also indigenous culture and resistance is really foundational to the United States and really has shaped how U.S. democracy was formed. So trying to write to that will probably be what the next podcast is about. Yeah, but thank you for that question. Cool. All right, maybe one last question, if anybody has one. No pressure. Okay. All right. Oh, yep, in the back.
Yeah, I was just wondering, what was the, I guess, in a way, the creative process to piecing everything together? How did you kind of focus where things need to go and how to get that story out there?
Oh, yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know if you've like seen that meme of that guy like with like the red string on the wall. There was like a phase of that. So I have like I live in like a little 2-bedroom house, and the back bedroom is like my writing room, and I have a wall that's like blank, and I'll tape up like all my thoughts on the wall because I kind of need to like see it. So as I was doing the research, I would take notes, and then when I would sit down to write chapters, I would spend a lot of time outlining them. And because the book goes like back and forth in history, I would sort of write it in chunks. And then after I wrote a chunk, I would read it and then put all the ideas back up on the wall. So a lot of it was trial and error. And so there were some chapters where the first draft of that chapter is very similar to what it is in the final product. And there are some chapters that there was a draft of and that chapter doesn't exist anymore. And it got like split up and is in all of these different chapters. Or there are some chapters where they were written and then they were split into two. So one of the things that the way I work is I try to do a lot of outlining first and brainstorming and thinking, but then often what you think will work on the page when it's actually on the page doesn't work. That's like the frustrating thing about being a writer. You're like, this was so good in my head and so bad in reality. And so then I would read the book and I would try to, one thing I have to do with my writing is you can get to a place where you can't really see the forest for the trees when you're really in it. And so what I would try to do is like take a break. So I might like just take a week off and not work on it at all. And then try to come back to it kind of with fresh eyes and then read a chunk and then revise. And I kind of wrote the book in thirds. So there's like a part 1, part 2, and part 3. And I wrote them in those chunks and then would kind of pause. But that was the hardest part, was sort of getting it to all work together. But definitely a lot of trial and error, a lot of trying stuff and then having to fix it. Cool. Yeah. Well, thank you guys so much. I love, every time I've been to the College of Muscogee Nation, it's been a great event. I really appreciate you guys all coming out on a Tuesday afternoon. It's been so great to hear your questions. Before we go, I wanted to give a shout out. I don't think either of them are, well, I know one of them isn't here, but a couple students from the College of Muscogee Nation worked on the book. Oh, is Amy here? Oh, I can't recognize you with your face mask. I can't recognize anybody with their face mask on. So Amy Harjo worked on the book. So she was really, really helpful. And then Alyssa Wind, who also went to school here, worked on the book. So I really appreciate all the support from the College of Muscogee Nation, both in making the book and being able to come here and share it with you guys. So thank you so much.
If you want a copy of the book, they have it out here in the lobby for sale. He told me he has signed copies and non-signed copies, and Rebecca is here. She's going to be out in the lobby signing copies for you, and there's also refreshments out there. So please help yourself, and thank you for coming. Have a good day.